There are stories that whisper their way into your life, and others that dig quietly until they find you. What you're about to witness on Veil Marks is not just a tale about a dog. It's a journey through memory, grief, love, and the extraordinary power of silence. As Viktor Frankl once said, "What gives light must endure burning." This story will move you and maybe even change you. Stay with us until the very end, because every detail matters, and the final moment will leave you breathless. If it touches your heart, please leave a comment and subscribe to Veil Marks. Your support helps bring deeper stories to life. I wasn't expecting much for my 67th birthday. Maybe a phone call from my daughter in Chicago, a quiet morning with a lukewarm cup of coffee, the creak of floorboards in the old Vermont house I've lived in for over 30 years. That's how it's been since Margaret passed. Cancer doesn't just take the person. It takes the sound of their laughter, the way they hum when they fold laundry, the weight of their side of the bed. It takes everything and leaves behind silence. That morning, the phone rang, and sure enough, it was Emily. She sounded cheerful, too cheerful. After the usual small talk and her gently probing questions about whether I was getting out more, she said she'd arranged for a delivery. A surprise, she said. I told her I didn't need anything. She told me, too late. It's already on the way. I figured it was another pair of slippers, or one of those talking picture frames that reads out memories. Instead, it was a dog, a big one. The truck pulled up just after noon. The driver, a young woman with a clipboard and a friendly smile, let out a giant pit bull with a wide chest, amber eyes, and a coat the color of charcoal. He looked like he could have taken on a bear. The tag on his collar read Rook. The woman explained that he'd been rescued from a bad situation, didn't bark much, and had no known health issues. Strong but gentle, she said. A real old soul. I signed the form, not sure what I was doing. Rook stood quietly by my side, tail still, eyes watching me like he was trying to decide whether I was safe to trust. I wasn't used to having company anymore, let alone one that could knock over my tool bench without trying. Still, I poured him a bowl of water, set out an old blanket near the fireplace, and figured we'd get through the next few days while I found him a proper home. But Rook didn't act like a guest. He moved through the house like he'd been there before. He didn't whine, didn't chase squirrels, didn't even sniff the couch cushions. Instead, he chose a corner of the living room near Margaret's favorite window and lay down with a sigh that sounded older than both of us. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed felt colder than usual, though I knew it was just in my head. I got up around 3, walked through the kitchen, and found Rook sitting by the back door, ears perked. When I opened it, he stepped out slowly, with purpose, not like a dog needing to pee, but like someone with somewhere to be. I watched as he walked across the frost, hardened grass to the far edge of the yard, to the old sugar maple near the fence line. It's a tall, wide tree with bark rough as gravel and roots that twist like ancient fingers through the soil. Margaret used to sit under it in the spring, reading garden catalogs and talking to herself. Since she passed, I hadn't paid much attention to it, but Rook did. He sat beside the tree, just sat, didn't sniff, didn't scratch, didn't dig. He just faced it, ears slightly tilted, body still. I watched from the porch, arms folded, breath fogging in the cold night air. After a few minutes, he came back inside without prompting, went straight to his blanket and curled up as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he did it again, and the morning after that. Every day, around the same time, Rook would walk out to that maple and sit, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes nearly an hour, always in the same spot, always with that same quiet attention. It wasn't playful. It wasn't nervous energy. It felt deliberate. I started keeping track, wrote it down on the inside flap of my calendar. Rook at the tree, 7:14 a.m. Rook, sat 45 mins, cold morning. Rook, tail wagged once, barked once. It felt absurd at first, like a man chasing shadows in his own backyard. But after a while, I started to wonder if maybe Rook wasn't just sitting out there for no reason. Maybe, somehow, he was waiting or remembering, or both. Margaret would have found it beautiful. She always said dogs saw more than we do, felt more than we give them credit for. I used to laugh at that. I don't anymore. There's a saying I used to hear, maybe from a neighbor or someone at the old wood shop I used to work in. Some dogs are just meant to find you when you need them. I never believed in fate. Still don't. But every morning when I see Rook by that tree, looking up at its branches like he's listening for something only he can hear, I can't help but wonder if he sees what I can't, or maybe what I've forgotten. I've never believed in ghosts. But since Rook arrived, I've started to believe in something else. Call it memory, call it instinct, maybe even grace, whatever it is. That dog sees something in that tree, and I'm starting to think it's not just bark and branches. It's the start of something. I just don't know what yet, but Rook does. And for now, that's enough. It was the first real thaw of the season. Overnight, the snow that had clung stubbornly to the edges of the yard had softened, and by morning, water ran in narrow rivulets down the sloped ground behind the house. I was standing at the sink, watching steam rise from my coffee, when I noticed Rook wasn't at the back door like he usually was. Most mornings he waited, politely, until I turned the knob. That day, he was already out there, standing near the base of the sugar maple. Tail low, ears up, I stepped out onto the porch, pulling my cardigan tighter. The wind still carried a bite, but the air had changed. There was something looser about it, like the land itself was stretching after a long sleep. That's when I heard him bark, just once, not loud, not frantic, just a sound of intent. Then he started digging. He'd pawed at that same spot before, but this time was different. He wasn't just pushing soil around like a bored dog. He was focused, deliberate. Clumps of wet earth flew behind him as his paws worked in a steady rhythm. I moved across the lawn toward him, boots sinking into the softening ground. "What you got there, buddy?" I murmured, crouching beside him. He stopped and looked up at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't name. Then he stepped back. That alone sent a chill down my spine. He had never done that before. Like he knew it was my turn now. I reached down into the shallow hole, brushing back the wet soil. My fingers hit something hard, cold metal. Carefully, the first pulled it out. It was an old tin box, maybe 6 inches long, covered in grime and rust, but the latch was still intact. On top, faintly etched into the lid, were the initials E.A. Inside, nestled between pieces of moth-eaten cloth, was a folded handkerchief, delicately embroidered with the same initials. The thread was faded lavender, and when I brought it to my nose, I caught the faintest trace of peppermint oil. Margaret used to use a peppermint balm on her wrists in the winter. The scent was so subtle, it nearly broke me. There was also a photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the corners. A woman stood beside a tree. This tree. Her hair was braided, her dress simple, her posture both strong and soft. I turned the photo over. No date, no names, just a single heart, drawn in pen. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in thin, crinkled tissue, was a letter written in elegant, looping script with what must have been a fountain pen. The ink had faded to a muted violet. Parts of it had bled with moisture and time, but some words were still legible. "Toin't not about healing the body, but the heart. Toin't tell them love is stronger than fear." And at the very end, if this ever finds light again, it means someone was still listening. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I felt Rook's wet nose nudge my arm. Back inside, I laid everything out on the kitchen table, handling each piece like it might fall apart if I blinked too hard. The house felt smaller suddenly, like the past was pushing at the walls. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. That afternoon, I drove into town with the tin box riding shotgun beside me. The town library hadn't changed much since the 80s, same worn carpet, same dusty shelf of Vermont folklore books, but the woman behind the desk was new, maybe in her 30s. I explained what I'd found, showed her the photograph. Her eyes lit up in that way young people get when history suddenly feels like a treasure hunt. Together we pulled out old archives, scanned microfiche, combed through local registries, and that's when the name appeared. Eleanor Ashbury, a nurse who'd gone missing in the winter of 1945. officially listed as presumed deceased, though no body was ever found, but there were whispers in the local paper from that era, letters to the editor, hints. One column stood out. A man wrote that Eleanor healed with something no medicine could bottle. Another called her the only light I ever saw in the dark. A third simply said, "She vanished, but I still hear her voice when I walk past the chapel." The librarian looked at me like I'd brought a ghost to life. Maybe I had. That night, back home, Rook sat by the fireplace, watching me with those old soul eyes. I held the photo again, tracing the woman's outline with my thumb. There was something personal in her face. Not familiar exactly, but resonant, like I'd seen her in a dream once, and had forgotten until now. The peppermint, the tree, the letter about love. It all felt too close. Margaret and I had been married 43 years. In that time, you collect pieces of each other, scents, sayings, favorite corners of the world. Something about Eleanor didn't just remind me of history, it reminded me of her. In the following days, Rook's behavior changed. He still visited the tree each morning, but now he would return and sit near the door until I grabbed my coat. Then he'd walk, not run. Not wander, but walk steadily towards some new part of town. The first time, it was an old storage barn on the outskirts. A week later, it was the chapel behind the cemetery. Then, the stone well on Shady Lane, half covered in moss. Each place had its own echo, its own sense of time curled in on itself. It was as if Rook was piecing together a story I hadn't known I was part of, and each step deeper into Eleanor's trail wasn't just about her. It was about me, about Margaret, about what we choose to remember, and what we're lucky enough to rediscover. Rook never barked again during those outings. He didn't need to. He had already spoken through the dirt, the box, the scent of peppermint that still lingered faintly on the handkerchief tucked into my pocket. And in a way, I think Eleanor had spoken to. Maybe the past isn't buried at all. Maybe it just waits for someone to dig gently. And listen, after the discovery under the maple tree and the name Eleanor Ashbury surfacing like a breath from a long-forgotten memory, something in me shifted. I didn't talk about it, not even out loud to Rook. But from that morning on, when he went to the door, I followed. There was no command, no leash, no plan, just a quiet understanding between an aging man and a silent dog. He would walk out, slow and steady, head forward like a compass needle locked on something unseen, and I would lace up my boots and walk behind him, sometimes with my thermos, sometimes just with my thoughts. The first place he led me after the tin box was an old orchard on the west side of town. Overgrown, unpruned, long since given up by whoever once harvested apples there, Rook weaved between trees until he stopped beneath a gnarled branch and pawed at the earth. Buried beneath the leaves was a canvas pouch with a small rusted medal inside a bronze star and a folded note addressed simply, "To the one who needs to know." The ink was nearly gone, but the name at the bottom was clear. E. Ashbury. Another piece. A few days later, it was the train station platform abandoned since the 50s where he nudged aside a loose plank and uncovered a stack of damp, yellowed postcards, bound with twine. None were mailed. On the back of each one was a short message, handwritten, in the same delicate cursive as the letter from the tin box. All of them ended with the same line, "We made it because you waited." I didn't know what it meant at the time. I still don't think I fully do, but it was enough to keep going. One morning, the frost was thin on the ground, and the air had that sharp Vermont bite that settles into your joints. Rook led me farther than usual, through the back trails behind the elementary school, and up a dirt path I hadn't walked in decades. At the top of the hill sat a small white house with chipping paint and an old wind chime barely hanging on the porch. I would have kept walking, assuming no one lived there anymore, but Rook stopped at the porch steps and sat down. I knocked gently, more out of habit than expectation, but after a few moments, the door opened. She was small, almost swallowed up by a thick knitted shawl, with eyes like river glass, soft, gray, and steady. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice fragile but not weak. I cleared my throat, suddenly unsure how to explain why I was there. My name is Caleb Morrison, I said slowly. 1. I think you might have known someone named Eleanor Ashbury. For a long moment, she just stared. Then, her hand rose to her mouth, and her eyes welled up. Oh my, she whispered. I thought I'd never hear that name again. Her name was Rose Alder, 91 years old, still sharp, still living alone. She invited me in and set 2 mugs on the kitchen table, one for me and one for her. Though she barely touched hers, Rook lay at her feet, as if he'd known her for years. I was 13 when I met her, Rose began. She taught us first aid in a little hall down by the creek. Not through the school. You understand, this was something extra quiet, kind of secret, really. My parents thought she was just another nurse passing through, but she stayed when no one else did. Rose paused to collect her breath, then looked directly at me. I always wondered what happened to her. After the fire at the chapel, she disappeared. No one ever explained. There was talk, of course, but no one ever came looking. No one ever said her name again. Until now. I sat there listening to her speak, feeling like I'd found a page of a book I hadn't realized was mine. And as she talked, something odd stirred in the back of my mind. There was a memory faint, like sunlight through curtains. I must have been no older than 8. My father had taken me into town on a training day for the local militia. They used to fire blanks in the fields to practice drills. I remember the noise, the sudden crack of rifles echoing like thunder, and how I ran, terrified, into the woods. I hid under a tree, shaking, tears blinding me. Then, someone found me, a woman. I never saw her face clearly, but I remember her voice low, warm, and the way she pulled something from her coat pocket, a peppermint. She pressed it into my hand and told me everything was okay. And beside her stood a dog, big, broad-chested, silent, just like Rook. I'd forgotten that moment. It had vanished into the folds of time, like so many small memories do. But sitting there in Rose Alder's kitchen, with Rook sleeping at my feet, it came back not as a dream, but as something that had always been waiting. It wasn't just Eleanor's story I was chasing. It was mine, too. All these places Rook led me, these letters, medals, fragments. They weren't just a history lesson. They were threads of a larger tapestry, one that spanned decades and strangers and pieces of myself I didn't know were missing. It's a strange thing to feel less alone by walking through the past, but that's what Rook gave me. He never barked, never whined, never asked for praise. He simply walked and waited for me to follow. And as I did, I found that I was not just a man trying to remember. I was a man being remembered by a tree, by a woman who vanished, by a dog who never once let me walk alone. It was a Sunday morning, gray and silent, with the kind of overcast sky that made the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. The usual birdsong was absent. Even the wind felt slower, heavier. Rook stood at the edge of the porch, his gaze fixed toward the eastern woods, like he was waiting for me to catch up with something he already knew. I followed, as I always did now. No words, no leash, just a quiet rhythm between us. He led me along an old trail I barely remembered, overgrown with wild vines and scattered stone markers long sunken into the earth. Eventually, we reached a clearing near the edge of town, where a house stood alone, cradled in time and neglect. The wooden frame sagged with age. Its windows were clouded over with grime. Glass cracked like old ice. Char marks clung stubbornly to one side of the exterior black streaks, up the siding, like the building had once tried to cough out a secret and failed. I'd seen the place before, of course. Everyone in town had. Locals called it the Quiet House. Some said it was haunted. Others said it was cursed. What was certain was that in the summer of 1965, a fire had broken out there under mysterious circumstances. The woman who lived inside a quiet, reserved tenement no one knew well had disappeared. No body, no explanation, just a burned shell and 100 rumors. Rook didn't hesitate. He stepped over the sagging porch boards and pawed once at the door, then looked back at me. The front door was stuck, I tried the handle, then my shoulder. It groaned open with a reluctant sigh. The air inside smelled of ash and old wood, tinged with something faintly floral like lavender gone bitter with time. The living room was empty, save for an overturned chair and a collapsed bookshelf. Dust blanketed everything. But Rook didn't pause to explore. He walked with purpose toward the far end of the hallway, stopping in front of a narrow door half hidden behind a fallen coat rack. It was locked. Of course it was. I went back to the truck and grabbed an old toolbox I hadn't used since Margaret passed. Most of the tools were hers, well oiled, carefully labeled, each with a worn handle shaped by years of use. I carried it back inside and got to work. The lock resisted at first, as if it were guarding something sacred, but eventually, the latch gave with a sharp click. Behind the door was a narrow staircase, steep and dark. I flicked on my flashlight and started down. Step by creaking step, Rook followed closely behind, his presence a comfort in the heavy silence. The basement was small, low ceiling, stone walls, no windows, but what it held was unexpected. Against one wall stood a wooden desk, covered in a layer of dust, so thick it looked like velvet. On it were stacks of papers, maps drawn by hand, lists of names, dates, coded notes in delicate cursive. There were journals, too, their leather bindings cracked but intact. A typewriter sat near the edge, its keys rusted but still legible, and beside it all, on a metal shelf, sat a bulky, old-fashioned tape recorder, a reel-to-reel model, plugged in. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I reached out and pressed play. There was a brief hum, followed by a click, then a voice. It was a woman's, unsteady, hoarse, but unmistakably human. Each word felt pulled from the depths of someone who hadn't spoken aloud in a very long time. If you're hearing this, it means the fire didn't take everything. It means someone found this place. I hope you're kind. A pause. Then a shaky breath. My name is Eleanor Ashbury. I was a nurse. I helped people. Not officially, not always legally, but I did what I could. After the war, there were people who didn't know how to come home. Soldiers, mothers, children. They came here. I gave them shelter, sometimes just for a night, sometimes longer. I kept their names safe, their stories safe, because the world doesn't always want to remember what it can't understand. The tape crackled. The sound of paper being handled. Then, more words. They said I was strange, that I kept too much, loved too much. But love is what got them through. Love and memory. But I'm afraid it's not enough anymore. The world is starting to forget, and I'm starting to fade. Another long pause. Then, quietly, if someone's listening now, please don't let it end here. The tape clicked softly as it stopped spinning. I didn't move. Rook hadn't either. He lay down on the concrete floor beside me, his body stretched out long, his head resting gently across my foot. He didn't whine or nudge. He just stayed there, still, present, like he was telling me without words, "You heard her. That's all she needed." I sat there in the dim basement for a long time, surrounded by the stories of people who'd been saved in secret. The room felt less like a place of sorrow and more like a sanctuary, not haunted, just waiting. I picked up one of the journals. Inside was a sketch of the house, a list of names underneath, and a note scrawled in red pencil. Fire took the roof, not the truth. When I climbed the stairs again, the world felt different. Bigger, sadder, but more connected. Like I was now part of a thread someone had been trying to pass forward for decades. Rook walked ahead of me, slow and quiet. At the door, he stopped and looked back. And I understood. The past wasn't gone. It was just buried. And he was the one who knew where to dig. After that day in the basement, something changed, not just in me, but in the town. And most of all, in Rook. It wasn't overnight, but little by little, people began to notice him. Really notice him. The giant pitbull who walked with quiet purpose, never barked, and always seemed to know exactly where to be. He became more than a rescue dog or a companion. He became a kind of symbol, The first time I saw it happen, we were crossing Main Street. A little girl with paint, smeared overalls, and a backpack 2 sizes too big stopped dead in her tracks and tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, pointing at Rook. "That's the dog from the library wall." Sure enough, someone had sketched him, a charcoal drawing pinned to the bulletin board between book recommendations and lost cat flyers. In it, Rook sat beneath the sugar maple behind my house, a solemn figure under heavy branches. There was something holy about it, even in pencil. The librarian told me later that more drawings had come in crayon versions from second graders, watercolor portraits from high schoolers. One boy sculpted a tiny clay rook and left it beside the display of war letters, with a note that read, "He remembers for all of us." Adults responded too, though differently. They'd nod when they saw him. Sometimes they'd tip their hats or whisper as we passed, "There's the dog from the story," or "He's the one who helped find the basement tapes." Some even crossed the street just to walk alongside us in silence for a block or two, as if being near Rook might stir something long buried. And me? I began to write. It started slow. Just a few lines in a notebook I found behind the spice rack. Margaret used to journal every morning while her tea steeped. I could never keep the habit, claimed I was too busy, too tired, too practical. But now, each night before bed, I'd sit by the window and jot down where Rook had led us, what we'd found, and the people we'd met along the way. I wrote, like I was telling Margaret everything I'd never said when I still had the chance. It felt like keeping a promise I'd made and forgotten. Then, one rainy afternoon, while sorting through the closet we used to share, I found a worn leather-bound notebook wrapped in an old scarf. It had Margaret's handwriting on the first page, her neat cursive, soft and sloping, exactly as I remembered it. I flipped through the pages, smiling at the grocery lists and garden sketches. But toward the back, tucked in between 2 pressed flowers, was a line that stopped me cold. "If you still love me, find the place where I last laughed." My hands trembled. The ink was faded, but I could see it clearly. A message I'd never known she left. I didn't know what it meant. Not right away. I sat with it for a long time, tracing the words with my finger, feeling the old grief stir like dust in sunlight. Then Rook stood up from his place, near the door. He looked at me, and there was no mistaking it this time. His eyes were full of something deeper than instinct. He turned toward the hallway, and I followed without question. We drove for 15 minutes without a destination, but Rook guided me through turns with subtle shifts of his body, watching the road as if remembering it from a lifetime I hadn't lived. Eventually, we pulled onto a dirt trail, half forgotten, overgrown with weeds. At the end of that trail was a gentle hill, covered in wild grasses and the last of the summer clover, and I remembered it was 1976. Margaret had packed a picnic basket with too much cheese and not enough fruit. We'd argued about it the whole way up the hill, and then spent the rest of the afternoon laughing under the sky, watching clouds turn into dragons and ships. That was the last time I saw her laugh from her belly. Uninhibited and free. We never came back here after life got busy. I stepped out of the truck and walked to the top. Rook didn't lead this time, he followed, like a quiet witness to something sacred. At the crest, I sat down in the damp grass, hands resting on my knees, and let the silence wrap around me. For the first time in 2 years, I cried, not the quiet tears that sneak out in the dark, but real sobs, messy, unfiltered, like grief had finally found its voice. I cried for the years I didn't know what to say, for the words I never wrote, for the moments I assumed would last forever. Rook sat beside me, pressed close, his warm body anchoring me to the earth. He didn't move, didn't look away. He just sat, breathing with me, being with me. It was then I realized something. Rook wasn't just showing me where others had left pieces of themselves. He was helping me find my own. He was more than a dog, more than a guide. He was a witness, quiet, patient, and impossibly present, a keeper of memory, not just of Eleanor's past, but of mine, of Margaret's, of every person who had ever carved something into this world, and hoped someone would notice. And somehow, Rook did. Every step we took together after that felt like a thread sewn into something bigger, a fabric of stories too important to lose. And I knew wherever Rook led next, I would follow, not to find the past, but to understand it, to feel it, to keep it alive, because some memories don't fade. They just wait for the right heart to return. It was buried deeper than any of the others. The ground had hardened with time, the edges of the old trail almost lost beneath overgrowth and fallen leaves. Rook led me there without hesitation, nose to the wind, moving with the kind of certainty that made me feel more like a student than a guide. We'd walked this trail before, but never this far, never to this spot. Nestled beneath a large pine, half covered in roots and weathered stones, was a metal corner poking just barely through the dirt. It shimmered dully under the weak morning light bronze, aged and untouched for what must have been decades. I knelt, dug with my hands, and pulled it free. A chest, heavy, solid. The front bore a small engraved emblem, EA. For the last bearers, I ran my fingers over the letters, feeling the cold bite of metal through my gloves. Rook stood beside me, silent, unmoving, like a sentry who had finally found what he was meant to protect. I carried the chest to the truck, heart pounding, unsure of what we'd just unearthed, but certain it wasn't meant to stay hidden any longer. That afternoon, I brought it to the town library. The head librarian, Mrs. Lambert, met me at the door, her eyes wide as she read the inscription. "We need to open this together," she said quietly. We did. Inside, wrapped in layers of delicate cloth and wax paper, were documents, a list of names carefully typed on yellowing paper, organized by year, some with dates scrawled in pen beside them. Men, women, children. Most had no notes, just names, but a few were marked survived or reunited. There were letters, 200 of them, most unopened. Some were addressed to mothers, some to husbands or wives, some simply to home. All had been written by people who'd passed through Eleanor Ashbury's hands. None had ever been sent, and at the bottom of the chest, in an envelope sealed with wax, was a single handwritten letter. The envelope was marked, "To the one who found memory." I opened it slowly, unfolding the thick parchment inside. The ink had faded only slightly, the handwriting still strong, elegant. "If you are reading this," it began, "then you have gone further than I ever dreamed. I buried this, not because I gave up, but because I believed someone would come looking not for me, but for what we left behind. The people, the stories, the quiet bravery of those who endured and chose kindness anyway. This is not a record for glory. It is a seed, something to grow, not to frame. Please do not hold it for me. Hold it for everyone who thought their story would be forgotten. And if you must carry it forward." It was signed simply, Eleanor. I didn't cry. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, holding the letter, while Rook sat beside me like he had since the beginning, still, watchful, and somehow knowing more than I ever could. The town responded quickly. The mayor approved a dedicated space in the library, a small gallery. Not flashy, not grand, but honest. The town's historical society offered volunteers to help catalog the contents of the chest, to preserve each letter, digitize each name, research the forgotten. People from every corner of town came to help, many of them elderly, many holding their own memories with trembling hands. They named the exhibit the Rook Room, for those who remember. I didn't ask for it, but I didn't protest either. It felt right. Inside the room, we placed a desk near the entrance. On it sat a thick-bound journal titled The Memory Book. Visitors were invited to write a line, a thought, a name, a story, something they didn't want the world to forget. Some wrote poems, some drew pictures, some simply wrote the name of someone they loved and lost. And Rook would often sit beneath that desk. Every afternoon when the sun slanted through the tall windows and the dust danced in the light, Rook would lie at the foot of the table, watching the people come and go. He never got in their way. He never begged for attention. But people noticed him. They often paused beside him before writing, or whispered his name as they left. Some knelt to pet his head, others simply placed their hand on his back for a moment, as if drawing courage from the warmth there. I watched it all unfold, and realized that memory is not just something we keep, it's something we share, and somehow, this big, silent dog had become the keeper of it all. He didn't dig up treasure, he uncovered truth, and truth, when handled gently, when passed hand to hand, when read by a trembling voice at a quiet library desk, can be more powerful than fire, more enduring than stone. It can be carried forward, even by a dog. The first snow came quietly. That winter, it fell in the middle of the night, soft and unhurried, blanketing the yard in a hush so complete, it felt like time itself had paused. I woke early, as I often did, but this morning felt different. There was a stillness in the house that went beyond silence, a kind of settling, like a book being gently closed. Rook was lying by the fireplace, just as he always did. His breathing was steady but shallow, his eyes half shut in that calm way he had when he was watching the world through a dream. He didn't get up when I walked in. He didn't lift his head or twitch his ears. I sat beside him and placed my hand on his broad back. He was warm, solid, alive, but I knew he wasn't waiting to go anywhere that day. For the first time in all our months together, Rook had no place left to lead me. His work was done. We stayed there for hours, just the two of us, the fire crackling low and steady. I spoke softly about Margaret, about Eleanor, about all the names we'd uncovered together. I told him thank you, not just for what he'd shown me, but for how he'd changed me, for being the quiet witness to something bigger than history. That afternoon, I carried him to the place where it had all begun. The sugar maple behind the house stood tall and bare, its branches wrapped in the last strands of wind-chimed snow. I dug the grave slowly, my old bones aching, but I didn't rush. Every motion felt sacred. I laid him in the ground beneath that tree, wrapped in Margaret's old quilt, the one with the faded autumn colors she used to drape over the couch in October. I placed a small carved plaque beside the fresh soil, one I had made by hand the night before. Though I wasn't sure why at the time, it read, "He never barked, but he remembered everything." The wind blew gently as I stood up, brushing snow from my knees. The chimes in the tree above sang their quiet song, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. Years passed. The Rook room grew with time. More letters arrived, more stories were uncovered. Other families found pieces of their past in dusty attics and long-forgotten boxes, and then they brought them in, adding to the tapestry. Memory was no longer hidden. It was alive, shelved, cataloged, shared. I kept writing, too. Every night, I added to the journal, not just facts or names, but reflections, thoughts, moments. Sometimes I wrote directly to Margaret, sometimes to Eleanor. Most of the time, I wrote to Rook. Then one spring, my daughter came home. She'd been gone a long while, busy with work, with raising her boy, but something in her voice on the phone had shifted, a softness, a pause between words. She arrived one afternoon with a suitcase in one hand, and my grandson's tiny fingers curled in the other. He couldn't have been more than 7, curious, wide-eyed, asking questions from the moment he stepped off the porch. "Grandpa, is it true your dog found treasure?" I smiled. Not treasure, something better. That night, I gave her the journal. It was worn at the edges, pages thick with ink and time. I placed it in her hands gently, the way you'd pass a family photo album or a fragile heirloom. "He took me farther than any war ever could," I said softly. "Farther than grief, farther than forgetting. Now it's your turn to keep it going," she nodded, eyes glassy. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The next morning, we walked together out to the maple tree. The plaque was still there, weathered but strong. My grandson ran ahead and sat beside it, tracing the letters with his fingers. "Will we get another dog?" he asked. I looked at the sky, at the way the early light caught in the branches, and smiled. "We don't find dogs like Rook," I said. "They find us." A gust of wind rustled the bare limbs above. The wind chimes swayed gently, releasing a soft, familiar tune, the same one that had played the morning I buried him, the same one I heard the day we found Eleanor's letter, the same one Margaret used to hum, without realizing. It was a melody of memory, of stories that didn't end, but changed hands, and as I stood there, 3 generations gathered beneath that old maple, I understood something clearly for the first time. The past doesn't disappear, it waits for someone to return, to listen, to remember, and then to carry it forward. Sometimes, memory doesn't live in photos or names, it lives in footsteps, in paw prints, in the quiet things that stay behind after the noise fades. On Vale Marks, we believe stories like this one deserve to be heard, remembered, and shared. As Maya Angelou once said, people will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. If this story stirred something in you, we invite you to leave a comment and subscribe to Vale Marks. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. It means more than numbers. It means we're not alone in believing that meaningful stories still matter. Your voice, your presence, your support, that's what inspires us to keep creating with heart